Hello, welcome to our notes for the first section of Unit 2. In Unit 2, we're going to be talking about the American Revolutionary War. We talked a little bit about the start of the war at the end of Unit 1. We talked about the first battle at Lexington and Concord, and a little bit about Henry Knox, for example, bringing the artillery down to Boston. In Section 1 here, we're going to talk a little bit about the start of the war, specifically kind of what's happening in 1776. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about was something that we mentioned a little bit in Unit 1, and that is kind of the breakdown of where people are at as far as patriots, loyalists, or being neutral. And this is a number that's really kind of debated a lot by historians even today. It's really hard to identify specifically maybe who was a patriot and who was a loyalist. For one thing, it changed during the war. You know, in the beginning of the war, you might have been a loyalist, and then as things started to kind of progress, maybe there were things or factors that made you eventually become a patriot. So these are some numbers that are kind of thrown out from time to time. Patriots, about 40%, loyalists, probably about 20%, and then people that were neutral, about 40%. So I've seen variations of this. I've seen people say it was about 1/3 of each. I've seen some people say that there were a little bit more patriots, maybe like 50%. But again, just kind of the basic understanding that everybody across the colonies is not necessarily all in the same boat, that there are people that either are neutral, just kind of aren't favoring any side at all. And as we talk about people that are neutral, sometimes students will say, well, gosh, you know, how could this war be going on and you kind of be in the middle of it and be completely neutral? One aspect of that I would have you think about is, you know, the war might not necessarily be happening in your backyard. So say you're somebody that's living in Georgia, for example, okay? There might not be a lot of actual action around you. So it might be something where you can kind of just say, I'm neutral, I don't really want to take a side in this. Part of being neutral for some people was trying to eliminate as much risk as possible in trying to offend either side. So for example, pretend that you're a business person, okay? If you're a business person, you might not want to proclaim yourself as a loyalist or patriot, because then you would kind of sort of automatically eliminate possibly half or more of your potential customers. So there were some advantages to being neutral. It might be a family reason. You might not want to get in the middle of a family kind of debate and stuff. We did talk about Lucy Knox in our last unit, and you know, she had a very difficult decision to make. Her husband, Henry Knox, was becoming more and more involved with the Patriots, and her family were loyalists, and so she had to make a really tough decision on whether or not she should go back with her family to England or if she should stay with her husband, Henry. And of course, she stayed with her husband, Henry Knox, and she never saw her family again. So some really tough decisions being made by people as far as kind of what side you're on, who you're going to support, and then even within what side you're on, what's the level of support that you're going to provide. So, you know, there's kind of like someone that's really gun-ho patriot. They've enlisted, they're in the army, but then there might be people that just decide to donate some food or, you know, cattle or something to the cause, but not necessarily go all the way and like enlist and things like that. So there's a lot of variations and kind of gray area around who's neutral, who's patriots, and who are loyalists. Now, there were some locations where there are kind of more highly concentrated areas of one side or the other. Some of the loyalist hotspots were mostly in the cities, New York City and New York State, and then also some little pockets in the South a little bit. Patriots were spread out pretty much throughout the colonies, but there were some really heavy concentrations around Boston and Massachusetts, and then also down in Virginia. So if we look at this map might kind of help us out a little bit. If you notice the key here, the purple are the rebel areas. So when we talk about rebels in this sense, we're talking about the Patriots, okay? And then you look and you'll see that there's kind of these little red areas, and you'll kind of see them on the coast here. Oops, sorry about that. You see them over here on the coast. And so the red areas are places that were loyalist hotspots. So again, if we look kind of up here, you know, in New York, especially around the city of New York, and then if we go down here to the south, there's some big pockets kind of in North Carolina, South Carolina. So again, if you look kind of like where the cities are at, that's mostly where you're going to see some really heavy concentration of loyalist areas. So Kind of interesting, kind of to see kind of where some of these places are at. You'll also notice that there are some areas here that are orange. Okay, so if you look at the key, the orange is strongly neutral. So you had some pockets up here, especially up in Pennsylvania, right around Philadelphia and different parts of Pennsylvania. And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about why there would be some pockets that were basically just neutral. And one of those reasons were some of these people were probably what we would consider pacifist. A pacifist is someone who does not support war. Now, this is not a term relating just to this particular conflict of the Revolutionary War. You could be a pacifist for any time period. So, for example, during the Vietnam War, some people claimed that they were pacifist, and that prevented them from wanting to enlist in the army or be drafted into the army. So, a pacifist, in some cases, is a pacifist based on religious reasons. So it could be a philosophical thing. You could basically just say, I am against the principle of war. That's something that I don't believe in with my personal beliefs. But most times it's tied to a religious core or religious belief. Now, one of the religious groups in this particular area, and if we go back to this map, if we see these large concentrations of neutral people in Pennsylvania, that's largely due to the fact that one of the major groups in Pennsylvania were the Quakers. And so the Quakers fundamentally in their religion do not agree with using violence to help solve conflict, so they don't agree with war. Now, it is interesting, there were some Quakers that did contribute quite a bit to the Patriot cause. Probably the biggest example or most famous example would be Nathaniel Greene. He was one of Washington's most trusted generals. He was a Quaker, and yet he was a general that fought in numerous battles. In fact, he was with Washington basically for the entire war, one of the only generals that was with Washington for the entire war, and he was a Quaker. So there are some exceptions to that as well. Now, Native Americans supported both sides in the war, and the reason it's kind of hard to identify what side Native Americans supported was because, again, there's so many different tribes. It's hard to just put a blanket statement out and say, oh, Native Americans supported the Patriots, for example, because there's all these different tribes. Different tribes have different considerations or reasons why they would join either side. They might have trade agreements with either the British or with the Patriots. They might have a leader that has some kind of connection to one side or the other. So Native Americans did not have a clear side that they fought with. They kind of divided up, and there are a lot of different reasons, very complex reasons, why one tribe might either be trying to help the Patriots or being trying to help the colonists, the Patriots. The Patriots or the Loyalists, I'm sorry. Now, of course, we've talked about that the commander of the Continental Army is George Washington. One of the things that makes this sort of significant is he is from Virginia, and we talked about one of the reasons why Thomas Jefferson was selected to be the author of the Declaration of Independence was because he was from Virginia, and there was kind of a little bit of an advantage to have somebody from Virginia, since it was the most populous state at the time, had a lot of the resources, a lot of the wealth. And so again, if you pull somebody from Virginia for that command of the Continental Army, you might be bringing in some of those advantages of having somebody from a very powerful state. So that was one consideration. Washington, of course, did have a little bit of experience. He was in the French and Indian War. He was about 21 at the time. At the time that he takes over command of the Continental Army, he's 43 years old. So to give you kind of a frame of reference there. But Washington's biggest concern once he takes over command of the army, and this kind of sounds a little bit odd, but his main priority is basically just keeping his army alive. He wants to keep his army alive, and as long as his army's alive, the colonies have a chance to win this particular war. We're going to talk a lot about strategy through the next couple sections, but we're going to see that not everybody necessarily agreed with this strategy by Washington. A lot of people thought that he was trying to avoid conflict, he was trying to avoid battles, but Washington had the foresight to understand that as long as he could keep his army alive, and they were moving, and they were present, that the cause still had some life in it. So we're going to talk a lot about this particular aspect as we go through, but just remember that his priority is to keep his army alive. Now, this was a difficult prospect for Washington because they lacked so many supplies, they lacked food, they lacked shelter. They're not going to have the advantage that the British Army is going to have as far as having an already established supply line and all the different things that they need to basically, survive through the winter, survive through a campaign. So Washington is going to very often write letters to Congress saying, "Hey, we need money, we need supplies, we're very low on this particular, type of food or whatever." And so Washington is going to continually ask for these resources. In fact, that's one of his major tasks that he does almost on a daily basis, is trying to communicate with Congress. There's going to be some very wealthy individuals that donate money, basically donate their entire fortune to the revolutionary cause for the Patriots. And so it's going to be really tricky just to finance and keep this army alive on the limited resources that they have. Sometimes students will ask about what happens with the women of the men that are enlisted in the Army. Some of the women do stay home and try and either maintain the farm or the business that the husband has. But there were some women that also followed their husbands to war. And there was kind of like a secondary camp that kind of followed along with the Army. And they would do various tasks like cook and do laundry and nurse the sick and stuff like that. So these were kind of a secondary group of people that followed along with the Army. So it wasn't unusual to have possibly your family or your wife very close by. Not necessarily in the same camp, but close by to kind of help out a little bit. One thing that we're going to talk about a lot in the next section is the concept of what a mercenary is. A mercenary is a professional soldier that is paid to fight for another country. And this seems like a really odd concept to us today because, basically every country kind of has a standing army and things like that. But what happens in this time period of world history is you have people in Europe, primarily in Germany, that are kind of like these big land barons. And one of the things that they do to protect their land, so for example, imagine like somebody owns, for example, like maybe half of Missouri, okay? So if you owned a large section of land, you would also have kind of like your own standing army to make sure that nobody came and attacked you or tried to take over your land. And a lot of times if there's not battles going on, these people are just kind of trained soldiers not really doing anything. And so one way that some of these land barons made money was they would loan out groups of men to another country where they could then fight in a war. So England hires about 30,000 Hessians. Hessia is a part of Germany, and a lot of the people that England has as mercenaries came from this one part. So they kind of got a general term of Hessians, even though they're not all from that specific part of Germany. But they hired 30,000 of these Germans to come and fight with the British in the colonies. So the next big area that we're going to kind of talk about is Washington's attack on Trenton. And in that particular battle, the Patriots are fighting, for the most part, the Hessians. So they're not really fighting British troops, but the Hessians are fighting for the British. So I know that's kind of confusing. We'll kind of talk about it a little bit more as we go through. But these mercenaries come to America to fight on behalf of the British. And you see a picture there of their uniforms. We'll talk a little bit more about the hats and their particular uniforms in the next section. But just kind of remember that the Hessians are the mercenaries that we're talking about. Now, one of the advantages, obviously, that the British have in this war is they have a navy, very established navy, probably at that time period considered one of the better navies in the world. And so they had a huge advantage on the seas in the early part of the war. It takes a while to get a navy established and created. You can't just go out and, build a boat in a matter of a couple weeks or so. So it's going to take a while for the American Navy to get established. So especially in the early part of the war, the British have almost complete control of anything that's along the coast. So if you can bring a ship up to the coast and you've got the ability from that ship to fire cannons and those kinds of things, the British are going to be able to maintain the coast. Now it's going to be a different story once they get inland, because it's going to be harder for them to kind of gain territory and then maintain it. But along the coast, it's a different story. Now, this will change kind of a little bit eventually as the war goes on, but just remember that at the beginning part of the war, the Americans don't have a very strong navy. We'll kind of wrap up this unit talking about one of the individuals we talked about in the last section in Unit 1, and that is Thomas Paine. We talked a little bit about Thomas Paine and how he wrote the pamphlet Common Sense. Well, in 1776, he comes out with a second publication. This one is called The American Crisis. And The American Crisis is a series of articles that are kind of put together. I think there's 16 different pamphlets kind of put together for this. But again, it's kind of like a rallying cry for the colonists, telling people kind of, why they should be engaged in this war, why they should support the Patriots. So kind of a little bit of a similar vein to the article that we talked about earlier with Common Sense. But one thing that's interesting about this is Washington, we know, used this to help rally his troops. We're going to talk about the Battle of Trenton here in the next section. When things were looking very bleak in 1776, this is something that Washington distributed to his troops. We know that he read part of it to his troops. So again, we can't forget about Thomas Paine when we think about important people from this time period. Even though Thomas Paine was not a soldier, he was not a military expert, the things that he wrote, Common Sense and the American Crisis, are very, very important to the cause because they're going to kind of rally the Americans towards the Patriot side. There's kind of an interesting quote from John Adams. John Adams was quoted as saying, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." So even people like Adams and Washington were acknowledging the immense influence that Thomas Paine had on the American colonists. So that's kind of the beginning part of the war. That'll kind of explain Section 1. In the next section, we're going to talk about one particular time period that I believe is probably one of the more critical time periods in American history, and that's kind of the middle of December until the end of December in 1776. We're going to talk about Washington and the attack on Trenton, New Jersey, and why that is probably one of the major turning points in the Revolutionary War itself. And without that very critical week or so, the colonists may have not been able to win the war. So that's Section 1. We'll see you in Section 2. Thanks.